Hi there, in this video we're going to extend the form that we built in the last video, and we're going to turn that into a registration form that redirects to a user's profile page when a user registers, and we're going to use HTMX and django-crispy-forms to do this without any refreshing of the page. So all of this work will be done via AJAX requests and handled by HTMX. And we're also going to use HTMX to render any form field validation errors without refreshing as well. So let's get started, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a user model that allows us to actually save a user to the database. This form at the moment that we built in the last video, it's quite unintelligent, it doesn't really do anything. So let's start by actually building a user model, and we're going to go to Visual Studio Code to do this. So this is the code from the last video. It will be available on GitHub, and we can go to the models.py file within the core application, and at the top we're going to do an import, and I'm going to import the AbstractUser, and this is a class that you can extend and build out your own fields in addition to the basic fields provided to you by Django's user model. And we're going to create a user class here that inherits from the AbstractUser. Now the AbstractUser already provides fields such as the username and the last name and the first name, as well as the email and password fields. These are all there and available on the Django default user model. So we already have those, but I want to add a couple of more fields here from our form. So this form, if we look at the front end again, we have a subject and an age and a date of birth. Now the age and the date of birth fields, we're going to remove the age because that can actually be calculated from somebody's date of birth. But what we need to add to our default user model is the subject and the date of birth fields. So let's go back to our models file and create those now. The first one I'm going to create is the subject field, and this is going to be a positive small integer field, and we're going to define some choices here, and it's going to be subjects.choices. So I'll explain this in a second. This comes from the forms.py, and we have a selection of choices here on lines 16 to 20. Now we want to make them available in our model, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create an inner class called subjects, and this is an inner class because it exists within our model class here, and this is going to inherit from something that's quite new to Django. It's called integer choices, and that's available within the models module as well. And integer choices is a subclass of Python's enum class, and it allows you to define choices in an object-oriented manner. So for these integer choices, I'm going to copy the subjects that we've got within the forms, and we'll paste them into the model in the format expected by the integer choices class. So if I paste these in, you see we have web development, systems programming, and data science, and they're given a number here. It's an integer choice after all, so we give them 1, 2, and 3. And this can be extended if you want to add other fields below that, and you can extend this with additional subjects if you want to. And Django's integer choices classes, they have a choices attribute that you can use to define your choices. So in this case, it's a positive small integer field with the options of 1, 2, and 3, and these map to the subjects you can see here. So that takes care of the subject. We also have a date of birth. So here you can see the date of birth. I'm going to define that as a date field, so let me copy that in here. So that's the two fields that we're going to use in addition to the basic fields provided by the AbstractUser class in Django. So that's all we need to do for this class. What we now need to do is tell Django that this is the user class we want to use, and we can do that within our settings.py file. So let's go to the bottom, and I'm going to paste in this setting here, auth user model. This tells Django which class you want to use as your user model, and in this case we reference the core application's user class, which can be found in the models.py file. So now Django knows that this is the user model we're using. It's not the default one in the contrib.auth module, it's this class here. So now we can make the migrations with this command, and that will create our user model in the database. And when we've done that, we can then run the migrate command, and that will create the tables within our database. So now that the models have been changed, we're going to convert the form class to use that model. So instead of inheriting from forms.form, we're going to specify that this is actually a model form instead. And we will import from our models this user model that we've created here. So let's clean up a little bit here. We can get rid of the subject choices, and we can also get rid of the age field. We don't need that anymore. And now what we're going to do is we're going to define what's called a meta class, and this is another inner class that ModelForms have, and you can specify a link to a model, In this case it will be the user model, and I'll paste these in here. It's the username, the password, the date of birth, and the subject. So these are the fields we want to actually show on the form. And let's now also change the subject. You can see we've got an error here. I'm going to remove the widget. And for the choices, we can use the user class, the subject's inner class, and the .choices attribute. This is the same one we referenced here, subjects.choices. That will give us the choices for the ModelForm's subject field. So if we save that and then run the server, we should now go to the front end and we can have a look at what this form looks like. You see we have a username field, a password field, date of birth, a subject, and looking at this form we've still got the name field, so let's remove that as well. We don't actually need this name field. We're going to use the username field instead. So we will save that and refresh. And now we've got username, password, date of birth, and subject. And these correspond to the fields that we use within the meta class. Now there's a few other things we need to do to this form to get us set up here. First of all, the password is visible. So we need to use a custom widget for passwords in Django. To do that, I'm going to define a widgets attribute in the meta class, and this is a dictionary that maps the fields to the widget you want to use for that field. And for password, we'll define the field as password. That corresponds to what we use as the field, and for that we're going to use the forms.password_input. This is a widget that can be used for the passwords, and that will hide the password on the front end. So if we refresh, we now see that we can't see what we're actually typing. That's protected, and that's what we would want for a password field. And finally, what I want to do is override the forms save method. Now this is a method that comes from Django's ModelForm, and I'm going to paste that code in here and I'll explain it after I do that. So we override the save method, and this method, when it's called on a ModelForm, it will actually save the object to the database. So it will save the object and create the user model for you in your application. The reason that I'm overriding it here is to set the password, because if we just save naively this form, we are not going to hash the password. That is a grave security concern. You want to hash the password and save the hashed version of that password in the database. Django's user model provides a set password function, and this function will reset the password attribute to the hashed version of the password that you enter. So that's the reason I'm overriding save. If I now save this file, we should be able to go to the front end, and we now have the form the way we want it to look. However, while we have the form looking the way we want it to, if we submit the form, it's not going to work, and that's because the form, if we inspect the form element here, it's set to go to the action of /, so it will go to the index endpoint that we have, and we can look at that view just now. This is not set up to deal with a post request from a form, so we need to change this view, and that's what we're going to do next in this tutorial. Now when the user submits the form, it should be done via a post request, so we need to change the helper's form method here. It's currently set to get, so if that's something you have, change it to post, and now that will change the form action to post. You can see it was get previously. Let's refresh the page and inspect this element. You can see it's now a post. So when you've done that, we can now go back to the view, and we're now going to write this view so that it can deal with both a get request and a post request. For the get request, this is very simple. We just want to do what we are doing already. So I'm going to say if the request.method is equal to get, then I'll execute the actions that we had before. So on a get request, it will just do what it was doing previously. However, if it's a post request, we want to do some different actions. So else if the request.method equals post. In that case, I want to instantiate the form with the request.post dictionary passed in. So to do that, we'll create a variable called form, and this is going to be equal to our university form, where we pass in the request.post, and this is a dictionary containing the key value pairs for our form fields, so that will populate the form fields accordingly. Now all forms in Django have an isValid method, and you can call that to validate the fields within the form. So if the form is valid, what we're going to do is we will call the form's save method, and we defined the save method within this form. We have overridden it, and we'll hash the password when that form is saved. So this is the function we're calling here in our view, and that will give us back a user object that we can use later on in this tutorial. And the reason it gives us a user, of course, is because this form is a model form. It's tied to the user model, and when we call form.save, that's going to save that model to the database and give us back the user class in Python. And for now, if the form saves successfully, I'm just going to return an HTTP response with the text hi, and we need to import that from the django.http module. Now this is the case where the form is valid. If it's not valid, we are going to render the form with the errors on the front end. So let's set up a context, and we'll create a form key within that context that points to our form on line 13, and then we're just going to render the same index.html that we did in the get request here, and we'll pass the context, and this will render the form with any errors that's been picked up. And of course we will have errors if we get to line 18 because the form is not valid and we haven't returned an HTTP response. So we'll render the index.html with the form containing the errors. So now that we have that, we're going to add a method to the form that allows us to define some validation rules. And what we want to do is ensure that the username is longer than 3 characters. So to do that, we're going to define a method to validate the username. So before we define that method, let's go to Django's documentation. Now, what you can do is when you're validating a particular field, you can create what's called a _fieldname method, and the field name here is replaced by the name of the field on your form class. So in this case, we want to validate our username field, which is here. So the function we're going to create is called cleanUsername. So I'm going to create that function here within the form class, cleanUsername, and you can get the username that has been entered using the self.cleaned data dictionary, and that key is the name of the field, which is username. Now here we have access to what the user's provided as a username, so we can perform any validation we want. So in our case, we want to make sure that the length is greater than 3, so we'll say if the length is less than or equal to 3, we're going to raise a forms.validation error. And this takes a message, and in this case the message is going to be the username is too short. Otherwise, if there are no validation errors, we simply return what the user has entered. In this case, we return username. So this gives us a little validation method that we can use to test our form, and we're going to test it with HTMX a little bit later on in this video. But for now, let's go back to the form and we'll test it out. So we'll refresh the page, and if we enter a short username with 2 characters here, and it doesn't matter what else we put in these fields here, we've still got the date widget. If we submit that, you see we get some feedback here. The username is too short. On the other hand, if we were to submit this with a longer username here, we will be able to do that, and we get back hi here, which is of course coming from our views.py file here on line 16, and that's the case where the form is valid. It doesn't get down to these 2 lines here where it renders the form with the errors. And one other thing to note is that because we've called the form.save method, if I was to go to the Django shell plus here and we load that up, we can now see user.objects.all contains that user that we've created, because we're calling a ModelForm save method that will commit the new user to the database. So we're able now to save that user to the database. So we're now going to update this form so that we don't need to submit it and refresh the page, and we're going to use HTMX to do this. So the first thing I want to do is reference the django-crispy-forms documentation. It's this particular section here, the Ajax validation recipe. Now this is used with jQuery, but we're of course going to use HTMX. But what we're going to do is we are going to copy some of the code from this particular recipe here. The 2 lines at the top, these imports, I'm going to bring them into the views.py file. So at the top, we'll copy them in, and this is an important function for Crispy Forms when you're working with HTMX. When you call that function, you pass it the form instance as well as any context, and it will actually return the HTML for the form. And that's very useful for working with HTMX, where you're often returning HTML fragments from the backend. This will actually give you the fragment for your form. So what we're going to start by doing is, in the case of an error, which is in lines 19 and 20, when form.isValid has returned false, we're going to replace what's returned here, this render statement, and we're going to return the form as returned by the render crispy form function. So if we go back to the crispy form documentation, I'm going to copy these lines of code here, and we can paste them at the bottom here. I'm going to get rid of the context because we don't need that anymore, and let me fix the indentation as well. So we have the form on line 15, it's been instantiated. We provide that form as an argument to the render crispy form function, and we also provide the context here with the ctx variable. And then what we're simply going to do is return an HTTP response with the string that is the form's HTML. Remember, this is just the HTML as a string with the form element and the input elements, and that is returned, and we'll use that to render our errors on the front end. So if we save that and we go back to the front end, Now if we inspect the form itself, we see that we still don't have any HTMX attributes. So what we're going to do now is to the form element itself, we're going to add HTMX attributes so that HTMX will handle this on the front end without refreshing the page. Now to do this, we're going to go back to the forms.py file, and at the top here we have this form helper from django-crispy-forms, and we've already seen a couple of attributes, the form action and the form method. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually comment those out because we're going to use HTMX. We're not going to directly use an action and a method. We're going to attach some HTMX attributes to this form. Now another attribute that exists on the helper, the form helper from django-crispy-forms, is the form ID, and I'm going to give this form an ID of university form. So if we save that and look at the front end, let's refresh first and inspect the element, you see that this form now has an ID of university form. And we can add extra attributes to the form element here via a self.helper.attrs. This is another attribute on the helper, and we're going to set that to a dictionary of extra attributes. And these are going to be HTMX attributes. We're going to define the hxpost attribute, and the hxpost attribute defines which endpoint the submitted request will go to. And we're going to use the same one we used for the form action. We want it to go to the index endpoint, the index view, so we will reverse lazy that URL. And the second HTMX attribute we're going to define is the hx target, and that's the reason I gave this form an ID of university form. I want to make that the target for the HTML response. We want to replace the form element with what's returned by the Django view. So if we save that, we should now be able to see these HTMX attributes on our form, and you can see the form element here has an hxpost and an hxtarget attribute. So let's now try and submit this form with errors. I'm going to create a random user here, and we're getting the feedback here, but that actually was using HTMX to submit the form. A post request was sent to the endpoint, but it didn't refresh the page. Let's see if we can test it again. If we look at the network tab while we submit this form, let me clear it out, and we create another user. And when we submit that, you see that it's an XHR request. This is an AJAX request, and if we inspect the response, you see that we get the form element and all the input fields within that back. So this is HTMX returning HTML to the front end and replacing the content that was there. And if we inspect the elements here, the HTML elements, you see that we now have two form tags on the page. So we're going to change this by adding another HTMX attribute to our form, and it's going to be the hx swap. And I want to swap with the outer HTML, and if we specify that, it's going to replace the form entirely. So if we go back to the front end now and we go back to the network tab, we should be able to enter another username here that is less than 3 characters, and this will render with the error message. But if we go back to the elements, we should see that if we inspect it, the form is no longer embedded within another form because we've replaced the outer HTML. You can see that attribute here. What that means is that it's not going to take the HTML and place it within the target. It's going to actually replace the target itself with the response content. So this is all working with HTMX for the failure case where there's an error. However, if the username is entered successfully, it's actually still going to refresh the page and give us this new template with hi. Let's change that now and go back to our views.py file. And in this block here on line 16 to 18, that's what we're going to change here. But first of all, let's create a new template. This is going to be called profile.html. And this is basically when a user registers, they're going to be redirected to this profile.html, or at least that's what it's going to look like to the users. But this is all going to be done with HTMX and with no refreshing of the page. And within that profile.html, we're going to paste some code here. It extends the base HTML template and defines a content block. And within there, we're going to display the user's username as well as the subject that they're studying. And we use the getSubjectDisplay to convert the subject's integer field, the number, to the actual display name. So now that we have that, let's go back to the view and we'll handle the case where a user successfully registers. The first thing I'm going to do is after form.save is called, I'm going to call the login function. And we need to import the login function, and I'm going to do that here at the top. So that's from django.contrib.auth. And the login function, when you called it, will basically create a session for the user that you provide. and it takes two parameters, the request as well as the user you want to log in. And we have that user from line 18 when we saved the model form. And after logging the user in, we can return the template. So I'm going to return the profile.html template. We're rendering that, we're passing the request, and that will then return this template. And because of the HTMX attributes on the form tag, this should work without any refreshing of the page. So let's go back to the front end and we'll refresh here, close the developer tools, and we're going to enter a valid username and we'll try and register this user. And you see now that it redirects us to this page where it lists out the new user's username as well as what they're studying, and it's doing this using HTMX to avoid refreshing the page. And when the request comes in on the view, after validating the form, we save the new user to the database and log them in, and then we render the new profile. And this new profile is accepted on the front end by HTMX, and it's swapped into this university form ID. So it will replace that element with the returned response, which is the profile page. Now, one thing we'd like to do is that when we are redirected to this page, we might want to update the URL that's displayed at the top. So to do that, I'm going to make use of a response header that's understood by HTMX. So if I go to HTMX's documentation, we have this response header hxpush, and that will push a new URL into the browser's address bar, and that's exactly what we want to use here. So let's go back to our views.py file, and we're going to add that header here. So I'm going to store the rendered template within a variable called template, and to that we can now add any HTTP headers we want. In our case, it's the hx-push header, and we'll set this equal to /profile, and that will be the new URL that we're going to push to the browser's history. Finally, we will return the template, and now we should hopefully see these changes reflected on our front end. So if I refresh the page, and now if we enter another username, just random users here, and we submit this form, we now see that the URL has updated and we see /profile. So that's pretty good. The last thing we want to do is give users the ability to log out with HTMX with no refreshing of the page. So to this page here, this profile page, we're going to add a logout button. So let's go back to our profile.html template here, and to this we're going to add some authentication if statements first of all. So if the user.is authenticated, only in that case are we going to show the logout button, and in fact we're only going to show these messages if the user is authenticated. Otherwise we will show a message saying you are not allowed. So if we end the if statement here, we can now write the code for our button. Separate this out a little bit. So within the is authenticated block, we're going to add a button that allows us to log out. So let's create a button element, and it will say log out. And here we're going to add some more HTMX attributes, the hxpost attribute, and this is going to send a request to the URL that we're going to define here called logout. And we're also going to add an hxpush URL to this particular button so that when it's clicked, it will reset the URL back to the default /. And because we're working with post requests, we're also going to add the CSRF token here, and we're also going to add a script at the bottom that will allow us to attach our CSRF token as a header to the request. And this code is necessary because Django expects a CSRF token on the back end, and we need to attach it. This mechanism for attaching is documented in this issue for HTMX's GitHub page, and I will link this in the description. This is the key comment here, so check that out if you're interested. And now that we have this, we need to define this URL for logging out. So go to urls.py and we'll write a new path here, and it's going to be logout. And what we're going to do is we're going to import from Django's auth views the logout view here, and this is a class-based view that we can use to log out and unset the session for a particular user. So I will use that, and we'll call the asView function. We'll give this a name of logout. That will make it match what we've said here in the URL template tag. And finally, I will spell this correctly so that it says logout. And the final piece of this puzzle is we need a URL to specify where we're going to redirect the user when they log out. So we're going to / a setting called logout redirect URL for this. So I'm going to write that down here, logout redirect URL, and it's just going to redirect to the / the root endpoint. And before we check out if this works, let's go to the profile.html template. We're going to change this event here to this particular event because HTMX actually updated this event name. And if we go to the GitHub issue that I referenced earlier, you can see that this particular comment, which is the one I copied, this is the event name here, but that was changed in HTMX more recently, and this is the comment you should be copying here. It has a new event name within the event listener. So if we go back to the profile.html, save that with the correct event name, and then we can go back to our form, and if we refresh the page, let's see now if this works. So we'll fill out the form, we'll give it a date of birth, and when we submit that, we are logged in. When we log out, we get this unexpected form showing up. Now, the logout is actually working, but the HTML that's returned is being swapped into the wrong part of the document. So what we're going to do is we're going to fix that, and we're going to add the HX target to the button here. This button within our profile page that handles the logout. Let's add an HX target to that. And the target we're going to add is the closest body. We want to replace the body of the document. So it's going to be closest body. Now this closest here is referenced in the HTMX documentation for HX target. The closest CSS selector, that is going to find the closest parent ancestor that matches the given selector. So the selector we are using is simply the body element, and it's going to find the closest parent that is a body element. There should only really be one body within the document, so it will find that and it will replace the content into that body element. Now the value of HX target as well as closest, which looks at the parents, can also have a value of find, which will look at the descendants. So this is quite similar, I think, to jQuery's keywords for this type of behavior. You can look at the parents with closest, you can look at the children with find, and in this case we're using the closest to look up the document at the body. So what we're going to do is replace the body with what's returned when we log out, and because the logout redirect URL goes to the root endpoint, that's going to then hit the index view with a get request, and that get request will then return the index.html form, and that will be swapped into the body. So let's see if that all works now by going back to our form, refresh the page, and if we enter a new user here and give them a date of birth, we now get logged in with the username, and if we log out, we are now redirected back to the form, and we can now try registering with another user, another date of birth, and again we get a new user, and this is all working with HTMX. There's no refreshing of the page. We're able to log in and create a session, and we're able to log out using HTMX, and we can also render the form with validation errors. And again, all done with HTMX. Django returns the HTML, which is swapped in to the correct place on the document, and it all works as we expect. So that's all for this video. We've packed a lot of functionality into this form here, and we're using HTMX to render the correct templates and replace them in the document. And we're still using django-crispy-forms. If we go back to our original index template, it's such a simple form that we're rendering, but it contains a lot of functionality, and that's down to this form class here, which has the crispy-forms form helper as well as our own fields. So thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Follow on Twitter if you're on there, and we'll see you in the next video.